Do you wonder what labs you should have run during your physical? Or you have some symptoms and you aren't sure what they are and you don't know what to ask the doctor for? Or you just want to have a better handle on your health? If that's you, and even if it's not you, stay tuned, because in this video I'm going to share a book that I think everyone should have and share what it's about, along with how it really helped me and my 17-year-old. So stay tuned. So I was recently reading a book called Common Sense Labs. And it's not a big book, but it's packed full of knowledge. This is written by Dr. Ken Berry and Kim Howerton. You've heard me talk about Ken Berry a lot. He does great work. He's an MD out of Tennessee, and he now works in the ketogenic sphere, helping as many people as he can fix their health, fix their metabolic issues through diet. And so that has become his mission. If you want to know more about him, his channel's linked in the show notes here, and definitely worth checking out. So anyway, I was reading the lab book, and it's just great. It goes through labs that I knew that were there, but I didn't know like what the value was or what the importance was on them. And I felt I really needed to know this for my clients, since I am a coach, but more so for myself and my family. And my 17-year-old was exhibiting signs of insulin resistance. And I wanted to know and be able to go to her doctor and sound semi-intelligent and say, this is what's going on. So I would like these tests run. And then be able to explain, because many times, you know, some of them are not tests that are necessarily in the doctor's wheelhouse. And so it was very important to know this. Now, what I really like about this book, before I get into how it helped my family, is that it's very nicely done. So colored pages. Now you can order an ebook, which would be then, however, if you wanted to print it, it would show up if you have black and white printer or color. But it goes through like the ranges, the history of how the lab values came, what the difference is between if you're eating a standard American diet, or why the optimal ranges would be different for, say, someone that is eating a proper human diet, which is very low carb, all whole foods, and even what the optimal range would be, because for some of these tests, what the medical association says is the standard is this huge range, and that would allow for a lot of things to get missed, and I found that out in our appointment. So it really goes through interpreting the labs and what annual labs that you should have, what the difference between some of them are, like the difference between a basic metabolic panel versus a complete metabolic panel, and why you want the complete versus the basic. If you're over, it's really geared towards adults who need labs, but I was able to use it for my 17-year-old and my children's labs. I'll still use the values in this book, but if they, seem odd or weird, perhaps because of their age, then I'll reach out for more clarification from some resources that I have. but it goes through each individual test and gives a nice, clear description of each of the tests. So this is really important because, you know, say you have a thyroid panel done and you're like, well, what the heck's TSH? It's right in here. TSH, and then tells what it is and what it does. So it's not a comprehensive, it's not an in-depth book where it's going to give you every nook and cranny, but it gives a lot. And then if you've got certain symptoms, so if you have certain symptoms, and I know it's really hard to see on this, there we go. If you've got certain symptoms, then over here would be the lab tests that you might want to request to have done. And often doctors will know, you know, to do them. But if you have signs of insulin resistance or hyperinsulinemia, a doctor may just look at an A1C, which is an average of the glucose in the red blood cells over the last 3 months, and that may come back in the normal range, but you may still, your pancreas may still be putting out too much insulin, and so there's really other tests that you need done, and a doctor very often won't even think about it because it's not the standard of what the medical association says is needed. And so this is very important because when it comes to insulin, if your cells are so stuffed full of glucose that your blood sugar starts rising and the cells are kind of ignoring the insulin, then the pancreas has to put more insulin out to try and stuff that glucose in any nooks and crannies and fat cells and wherever that it can to keep the glucose down. So you may have normal glucose readings, like if you were to finger prick, they may be maybe a little bit on the high side, or it might take them a little longer to come back down to normal after eating. Your A1C might be in the normal range, but maybe more towards the higher range. But you can still have insulin resistance going on and not know it. And that is the case with my daughter. So this book is it's chocked full of information. So I can't recommend this book highly enough. I'll link where to get it because it's not on Amazon. You can only get it through the book website. And it's just really well worth it. It goes through the sex hormones, if you're a female, male. So if you're needing to know like testosterone or say PCOS, or you've got like certain symptoms. Again, like I said, thyroid, insulin, it is in this book. It's not a super expensive book, but it is definitely a great tool and resource to have. Now, how it helped us is, again, I said my 17-year-old over the past year has been exhibiting signs of insulin resistance, and through my studies I was really seeing it. Now, not like type 2, not like diabetic, but you could tell. So she was having more asthmatic symptoms, and she has like the chicken skin on the back of her arms. Is keratosis pilaris. That's a sign of insulin resistance. She's starting to get color discoloration on her throat, And I'm now learning that that is actually could be a sign of insulin resistance. And there's two things that kind of go hand in hand. There's insulin resistance, which is where the cells are resisting that insulin. And there's hyperinsulinemia, which is where you're having to put out more insulin. And so the resistance is the cells resisting. The hyperinsulinemia is the pancreas having to put out more insulin, like too much insulin, to keep that blood sugar normal. And that just is a basic, simple, non-medical description of those. So anyway, we started with a new doctor, and I knew what tests that I wanted to have run because I needed to see what her pancreas was doing. And so, we went into the doctor for the physical, and I said, I want a C-peptide run, I want a fasting insulin run, and a new A1C, because her A1C, though it was high normal, it was, for being a 17-year-old, really was pre-diabetic. Because again, a high normal for someone that's, say, 30 or 40, you may still be okay, but for a 17-year-old, it should be way down. So the doctor did not want to run a C-peptide. She said what I expected, that it was not proper protocol, it was not standard of care, we didn't have a diagnosis, so there was no reason. And in my mind, I'm thinking, well, how do you get a diagnosis without the tests? She felt fasting insulin would give us what we needed, even though she didn't think that that was needed, which is just fine. That's her opinion, and she's a very good doctor, and I'm very happy that, we were able to move the kids over with her. She came very highly recommended by some friends of ours. And so I just said, look, these are the tests that I want done. I know what they are. I understand that you do not feel that it's a standard of care, but sometimes we need to move outside of the standard of care. So please run these so that I don't have to go to an individual lab and get them done. My insurance will pay for them, and that's all that matters. So at my insistence, she did run them, which I'm thankful for. And that's the other thing that the book will tell you is if you do need to get your own labs run, what companies do that and how to go about doing that. So that's a real nice resource because up until that time, I didn't know that you could, I thought you had to go to a doctor and fight to get certain labs run. So she did run them even though she feels that there's no value. And again, that's okay. That is her opinion. And as a informed patient, which I hope that we all are, we need to be able to say, look, doc, I understand this is not what the AMA says is proper protocol, but I don't fit in a box. And I need these tests done because I don't fit in that box. And even if you don't know how to read them or even what they are, just order them. You can put it in my chart that I insisted, and I know what to do with the numbers. You could even say, hey, would you like to borrow my book? Or would you like to keep it? I'll order another copy. Or I've got 5 copies at home because I want to be able to give these out. Let's learn together. Most doctors, they don't have the time to find the good resources. They know what they are fed through their training. And if they're not an independent doctor, meaning like a small clinic or off on their own, where they can not have to toe the line of what the big conglomerate says, you have to do, which we learned in 2020. There were many doctors that had their hands tied and slapped and weren't able to take care of patients because the heads of their organizations said, no, we don't do that. That's not standard protocol. That's not standard of care. As patients, we need to change the standard of care. We need to make the standard of care individualized. And this is how we're going to do it, by working with our doctors. By going and saying, I know you don't see any value in this test, but I do, so please just order it. And we can look at the values together, and we can be a team, and we can make a plan. And so that's what I did. So we got the labs back, and actually the doctor was very good. She wanted to order thyroid testing, which I wasn't even going to ask for, because I already knew it was going to be an uphill battle for the test that I wanted. So she wanted to order thyroid tests and some other things for Natalie, which was my daughter, which was great. Although with the thyroid, she did not want to do the full panel. She doesn't think that the T4 and the free T3 bring any value to the table. So unfortunately, I have an incomplete picture because they really do, but that's okay. It's baby steps. If I need to go to an independent lab to get those run, I will. I'm glad that she ran the test that she did run, because even that, some doctors won't even run those. So they'll run the THS and not the reverse T3 and not the antibodies. So at least we got those. So that was great. So anyway, nurse calls and leaves a message on the phone saying that my daughter's C-peptide and fasting insulin were within normal ranges. And I kind of beat my head against the wall because the values weren't online yet. I couldn't find them. And she didn't give what they actually were. So I had no idea, because with the labs, there's the standard ranges, and then there's the optimal, like I said before. So it's kind of like this curve, and the book goes in to tell you how they come up with those values. But basically, like, and this is paraphrasing, 100 random people, you test for these things, and everyone's diet is different, and so then they take those numbers and the averages, and it kind of goes into this bell curve, and then you get your range, okay? But to have tighter control, especially when we're talking about metabolic issues, instead of having this huge range, you really want to have a tight range, because you can have a normal A1C, like I said before, and have higher markers showing that you're trending towards prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, and then all of a sudden, you've had these symptoms, but you're told your A1C's fine, everything's fine, no worries. And then one day you go in and they're like, oh, look, you're now type 2 diabetic, you have to go on this medication. And you're like, well, how did I get here? Well, you could have been trending that way for a decade and not known. But if you would have had these tests and looked at the optimal value, you could have nipped it in the bud. So my daughter had an A1C in August of 5.6. 5.7 is pre-diabetic. So she was working hard by cutting out snacks and things like that. And so we did have a new A1C run. It came down from 5.6 down to 5.4, which is better. But it still is on the high side for a 17-year-old. And she does still have the signs of, the insulin resistance. So I just want to kind of show when we look at, fasting glucose, which is one of the things that doctors will typically run. That was not a fight. That was easy to get. Actually, I didn't even ask for that. But fasting glucose for the standard is 65 to 99 milligrams per deciliter. And so that's just how they measure, that's the units of measurement for that particular test. There's a few different ones. So I'm just going to give the numbers and not the units of measurement. It would be on your lab thing. So optimal is 65 to 86. So you really want it to be less. And in a healthy person, it would be a lot lower, than the 99. Hers was elevated even more than the 99. So she was even outside of the standard range. Not by too much, but enough that even the doctor did acknowledge, yeah, that would indicate that there's some insulin resistance going on. Okay, good, we're on the same page. But then we get to the C-peptide, and the C-peptide, the standard is 1.0 to 4.4. Now that's a big range. And so that basically means like how much is your pancreas putting out. So like a type 1 diabetic like my husband would have basically a 0 because there's no insulin. Someone that's deep into type 2 would have, in the above the 4 range, even in the, 3s, even though the standard says 3 is okay, optimally, remember I said you wanted with this is metabolic. You really want to have a tight control on that. 0.5 to 1.6 is anything above the 1.6, you're heading into metabolic issues. You might not be type 2 diabetic yet, but you're headed down that path. So, and then fasting insulin, this just blows my mind. Okay, so fasting insulin is when you have not eaten anything and you've only drank water for 12 to 14 hours. They draw your blood. 2.6 to 24.9. How in the world is there this huge span? If you have a fasting insulin where you're pumping out like all this insulin when you're fasted, that means that your glucose is extremely elevated. And if you haven't had anything to eat, why is your glucose extremely elevated? See, we have to think. So, again, optimal, you want a small window. 2.0 to 5.0. Anything above that 5.0, you're headed down a bad metabolic path. And so my daughter's both her C-peptide and her fasting insulin were elevated. And to me, those were huge pieces of the puzzle because they said it fit with her symptoms. The doctor said there was no reason to do them. She did them only for me, and they didn't give any value. And I'm hoping that as we grow in our health team relationship, that I can help her see why these did bring value. Because if we didn't have these, and we look at the fasting glucose, we say, well, fasting glucose is a little high, but A1C is fine. So maybe you just had something high carb that you were still burning off. So you're fine. Your symptoms don't, these tests show that your symptoms are of no concern. But now that I have the C-peptide and the fasting insulin, I can say, whoa. She might have a normal A1C, but her other tests indicate she is in insulin resistance. And she's headed down the path. So this gives me the information that I need to sit down with my daughter and say, look, these tests are high. This is what we need to do. So I think this is how we're going to change things, is by becoming knowledgeable patients and by helping our doctors see why they need to learn more. I'm grateful for good doctors. I'm grateful for doctors that want to say, yeah, I want my patients to be healthy. So I don't know what these tests are, but if you want them, I'll run them. And that's where we need to get. So, if you have a doctor that's willing to work with you, and not all of them are, and then you might need to find a new doctor. But if you have a doctor that's willing to learn, and maybe you can learn together, or they don't balk at you giving them information and resources, that's a gem. That's great. Try and teach your doctor. But you have to learn first, and you have to be informed enough that you can take care of your own health. So in our situation, I'm able to help my daughter and was able to have a nice discussion with the doctor as to why these tests were important, even though they're not part of the standard of care. Because it gave us a picture and that matched her symptoms. Now, am I going to have these tests run for my other children? No. Why? Because they don't have symptoms. If she wouldn't have been exhibiting these symptoms and was just a normal 17-year-old, then there would have been no reason to ask for them. But she had the symptoms, so we needed the tests. And even though the standard protocol says these tests aren't needed, they really were. So I just wanted to share, get this book, read it, and then if you're under the care of a physician during your annual physical, get the labs that it says. If you are having issues with, various symptoms or whatever, again, read in the book because it's really good. And we'll tell you which tests. So if you're having, a lot of pain or fatigue or, whatever, you might want to get your inflammation markers checked. That's all in the book. Definitely worth it. Worth getting a couple of copies. You can order, again, like I said, you can order the digital copy. I like to have a book in my hand. I don't like to read things on the computer or an e-reader, but if you do, hey, do you just get it? If you found this video helpful, please share this, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to subscribe to my channel. I hope you have a blessed rest of your week.